You know, there's something I've been thinking about lately that I believe many of us, especially at our stage in life, need to hear. We've all met that person, haven't we? The one who says yes to everything, agrees with everyone, and bends over backward to make sure nobody ever feels uncomfortable around them. Maybe, if we're being honest, that person has been us. But here's what I've learned after all these years, and what I want to share with you today: being too friendly, constantly trying to please everyone, isn't the virtue we thought it was. In fact, it might be doing more harm than good, not just to others, but to ourselves. Today, we're going to explore why setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary. Why saying no sometimes is actually an act of love. And why the most respected people in our lives aren't necessarily the friendliest ones, but the ones who know their worth and aren't afraid to show it. If this resonates with you, I'd love for you to hit that like button and let me know in the comments below. Sometimes the most important conversations start with the hardest truths. The hidden cost of being everyone's yes person. Let me tell you about Margaret from Springfield, Illinois. Margaret was 72 years old when her daughter finally convinced her to see a counselor. For decades, Margaret had been the go-to person in her family. Need money? Call Margaret. Need someone to babysit at the last minute? Margaret's available. Need someone to listen to your problems for 3 hours straight? You know who to call. Margaret thought she was being loving, helpful, the kind of mother and friend everyone would want. But by the time she reached her 70s, she was exhausted, resentful, and surrounded by people who had learned to take her for granted. Her adult children rarely asked about her needs. Her friends assumed she'd always be available to help with their problems. And she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked, "Margaret, what do you need?" The counselor asked her a simple question that changed everything. "Margaret, when was the last time you said no to someone?" She sat there for 10 minutes, trying to remember, and couldn't come up with a single instance in the past 20 years. This is what happens when we confuse being friendly with being valuable. We start to believe that our worth comes from our availability, our agreeableness, our willingness to disappear our own needs to make room for everyone else's. But here's the truth that might surprise you. The people who respect us most aren't the ones we never disappoint. They're the ones who know we have standards, boundaries, and self-respect. Think about the people you most admire in your own life. Are they the ones who say yes to everything? Or are they the ones who are thoughtful about their commitments, who value their time and energy, who show up fully when they do say yes because they've been selective about what they agree to? The difference between kindness and people-pleasing? Now, I want to be clear about something important. I'm not suggesting we become cold, unfriendly, or uncaring. There's a world of difference between kindness and people-pleasing, and understanding this distinction might be one of the most important lessons we can learn at any age. Kindness comes from strength. It's choosing to be generous with our time, energy, and resources because we want to, not because we're afraid of what will happen if we don't. Kindness has boundaries. It says, "I care about you, and I also care about myself." People-pleasing, on the other hand, comes from fear. It's saying yes when we mean no, agreeing when we disagree, and disappearing ourselves to make others comfortable. Consider Robert from Dallas, Texas. At 68, Robert was known as the friendliest guy in his neighborhood. He'd lend his tools to anyone who asked, never expecting them back. He'd agree to help with every community project, even when his arthritis was flaring up. He'd listen to his neighbor's marital problems for hours, even when he had his own worries keeping him up at night. But Robert noticed something troubling. When he had a heart attack at 69, very few of those neighbors showed up to help. The tools he'd lent were never returned. The community projects continued without anyone checking if he was okay. Robert realized he'd been so focused on being liked that he'd never actually built real relationships. He'd been a doormat disguised as a friend. The turning point came when Robert started saying no. Not to everything, but to the things that drained him or came from people who only reached out when they needed something. He started asking for his tools back. He began sharing his own struggles instead of just listening to everyone else's, and something remarkable happened. The people who truly cared about him stepped up, and the ones who were just using him stepped away. For the first time in years, Robert felt like he had real friends, not just people who found him useful. Why boundaries are actually acts of love. Here's something that might change how you think about boundaries forever. When we don't set boundaries, we're not just hurting ourselves, we're actually hurting the people we think we're helping. Let me explain what I mean. When we say yes to everything, we're robbing other people of the opportunity to grow, to solve their own problems, to develop resilience. We're sending a message that we don't believe they're capable of handling their own lives. That's not love. That's control disguised as helpfulness. Take the story of Eleanor from Portland, Oregon. Eleanor had been helping her adult son David with money for 15 years, every time he had a financial crisis. Mom was there with a check. She thought she was being a loving mother, but what she was actually doing was preventing David from learning to manage his money, to face consequences, to grow up. When Eleanor turned 75, she realized she'd spent most of her retirement savings bailing David out. Worse, David had never learned to be financially responsible because he always knew Mom would rescue him. Eleanor had to ask herself a hard question. Was her constant financial help actually helping David, or was it keeping him dependent and immature? Eleanor made a difficult decision. She sat David down and explained that the financial help would stop. She offered to pay for financial counseling instead, but no more bailouts. David was angry at first, accused her of not loving him anymore. But within a year, something amazing happened. David got a better job, started budgeting, began taking responsibility for his choices. Their relationship became healthier, more equal, more respectful. Eleanor learned that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is say no. Sometimes caring means letting people face the consequences of their choices, even when it's uncomfortable to watch. If you're finding this helpful, I'd appreciate it if you take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss future content like this. The respect that comes with self-respect. There's something fascinating about human nature that becomes especially clear as we get older. People don't actually respect the person who always agrees with them. They respect the person who has opinions, standards, and the courage to express them respectfully. I think about Ruth from Phoenix, Arizona, who attended the same book club for 20 years. For most of those years, Ruth went along with whatever book the group chose, even when she hated it. She agreed with interpretations she thought were completely wrong. She never suggested books she actually wanted to read. Ruth thought she was being a good member of the group, easy to get along with. But Ruth noticed something troubling. Other members would make decisions about the club without consulting her. They'd change meeting dates without checking if she could attend. When she did speak up in discussions, people would look surprised, as if they'd forgotten she was there. Ruth had been so agreeable for so long that she'd become invisible. Everything changed when Ruth finally found the courage to suggest a book she really wanted to read. To her surprise, several other members were excited about her choice. When she disagreed with an interpretation, she found that the discussion became more interesting, not less. When she admitted that she wasn't enjoying a particular book, 3 other members confessed they weren't either. Ruth discovered that her opinions had value, that her preferences mattered, that the group actually became more vibrant when she showed up as herself instead of as an echo of everyone else. By being willing to disagree, to have preferences, to sometimes be the dissenting voice, Ruth became a valued member of the group instead of just a warm body filling a chair. Teaching others how to treat us. Here's a truth that took me many years to fully understand. We teach people how to treat us. Every time we accept behavior that doesn't feel right, every time we say yes when we mean no, every time we let someone cross a boundary without consequence, we're actually training them to treat us that way in the future. Consider the story of William from Charleston, South Carolina. William's weekly poker game had been going on for 12 years. Every week, The same 5 guys would meet at William's house. William provided the food, the drinks, the cards, cleaned up afterward. He told himself he enjoyed hosting, but the truth was, he was afraid that if he asked the others to take turns hosting, they might say no, and the game would end. Over the years, William noticed that the other players started showing up later, leaving earlier, expecting more elaborate food. They'd track mud through his house, leave messes in his bathroom, help themselves to drinks from his refrigerator without asking. William felt taken advantage of, but he was afraid to say anything. The breaking point came when one of the players criticized the food William had prepared, saying it wasn't as good as what his wife made. William realized that by never asking for help, never setting expectations, never pushing back on behavior that bothered him, he taught these men that his time, effort, and home had no value. William made a change. He announced that the hosting would rotate from now on, and if someone couldn't host when it was their turn, they'd be responsible for providing the food and drinks for whoever did host that week. 2 of the players complained, said it was too much trouble, and stopped coming. The remaining 3 were actually relieved. They'd felt guilty about William always doing everything, but hadn't known how to change the dynamic. The poker game became more enjoyable for everyone. William learned that when we respect ourselves enough to ask for fair treatment, we often find that reasonable people are happy to give it. The unreasonable people reveal themselves by their unwillingness to treat us with basic consideration. The freedom that comes with authenticity. There's something liberating that happens when we stop trying to be everything to everyone. When we stop exhausting ourselves trying to manage other people's emotions, opinions, and reactions. When we finally give ourselves permission to be human, flawed, and real. Let me tell you about Catherine from Seattle. Washington, Catherine spent 67 years being the family peacekeeper. Whenever there was conflict, Catherine would smooth things over, absorb the anger, minimize her own hurt feelings to keep everyone else comfortable. She thought this made her indispensable, the glue that held the family together. But Catherine was miserable. Family gatherings filled her with anxiety because she knew she'd spend the entire time managing everyone else's emotions. She had ulcers from the stress of trying to keep everyone happy. She realized she didn't even know what she actually thought about most things because she'd spent so long figuring out what other people wanted to hear. The change started small. At her granddaughter's birthday party, when her son made a comment that hurt her feelings, instead of laughing it off like usual, Catherine quietly said, "That wasn't very nice." Her son was surprised but apologized immediately. Catherine realized the sky didn't fall. The family didn't implode. Her son actually seemed to respect her more after she stood up for herself. Gradually, Catherine started expressing her real opinions, her actual preferences. She stopped volunteering to handle every family crisis. When family members complained about each other to her, she started saying, "You should talk to them directly about that." Some family members were uncomfortable with the new Catherine at first, but something wonderful happened. The family actually became stronger, not weaker, when Catherine stopped being the emotional buffer. Family members had to learn to communicate directly with each other. Catherine discovered that authenticity is like a magnet. It repels the people who want to use us, but it attracts the people who want to know us. Real relationships can only exist between real people, and we can't be real if we're constantly performing friendship instead of living it. The art of graceful boundary setting. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This all sounds good in theory, but how do we actually start setting boundaries without destroying our relationships or coming across as selfish or mean? The truth is, boundary setting is a skill. And like any skill, it gets easier with practice. The key is learning to set boundaries with grace, firmness, and love. It's not about becoming harsh or uncaring. It's about becoming honest and self-respecting. Think about James from Houston, Texas. James had a neighbor who would call him several times a week to complain about various things: the weather, politics, health problems. These calls would go on for an hour or more, and James felt trapped. He cared about his neighbor, but these calls were draining his energy and taking time away from things James actually wanted to do. James learned to set a loving but firm boundary. When his neighbor called, James would listen for about 10 minutes, then say, "I can hear you're really frustrated about this. I need to get going now, but I hope your day gets better." At first, the neighbor was surprised and a little hurt, but James was consistent and kind. Eventually, the neighbor learned that James cared but had limits on his availability. The relationship actually improved. The neighbor started being more thoughtful about when and why he called. Their conversations became more focused and meaningful. James learned that boundaries don't end relationships. They improve them by making them more sustainable and respectful. Take a moment to like this video if you're finding these insights valuable. It helps other people discover content that might change their lives too. Recognizing the people who truly deserve our energy. One of the most important skills we can develop, especially as we get older, is learning to recognize the difference between people who deserve our full friendship and people who are just taking advantage of our kindness. Real friends appreciate our boundaries. They don't guilt trip us when we say no. They check on us when we're going through difficult times, not just when they need something. They respect our time, our feelings, our right to have opinions that differ from theirs. I think about Dorothy from Denver, Colorado. Dorothy thought she had dozens of friends because she was always helping people, always available, always agreeable. But when Dorothy's husband passed away, she discovered the painful truth about who her real friends were. Most of the people she thought were close friends disappeared when she needed support. They were uncomfortable with her grief, annoyed that she was no longer cheerful and helpful all the time. But a few people stepped up in ways that surprised her. Her neighbor across the street, whom she'd barely spoken to in 5 years, started bringing her dinner once a week. A woman from her church, who Dorothy had always thought was a bit standoffish, called every day just to check in. Dorothy's sister-in-law, who she'd always thought was too busy to care much about her, drove 400 miles to spend a week helping Dorothy sort through her husband's belongings. Dorothy learned that real friendship isn't about being useful or agreeable. It's about being authentic and allowing others to be authentic too. The people who appreciated the real Dorothy, complete with her grief, her bad days, her need for help, those were her true friends. The ones who only liked her when she was giving and never receiving, were never really friends at all. Building confidence through boundary practice. Setting boundaries is like exercising a muscle. The more we do it, the stronger we become. Every time we say no to something that doesn't serve us, we're saying yes to something that does. Every time we protect our energy, we're investing in our ability to show up fully for the things and people that matter most. Start small. Maybe it's not answering your phone during dinner time. Maybe it's saying, "Let me think about that and get back to you." Instead of immediately agreeing to requests, maybe it's expressing a preference instead of always saying, "Whatever you want is fine with me." Consider Frank from Atlanta, Georgia. Frank started his boundary practice by doing something very simple. He stopped saying sorry for things that weren't his fault when someone bumped into him, instead of apologizing. He'd say excuse me or nothing at all when he had to cancel plans due to illness instead of profusely apologizing. He'd simply say, "I won't be able to make it tonight. Let's reschedule soon." This tiny change started shifting how Frank saw himself and how others saw him. He realized he'd been taking responsibility for everyone else's comfort, even in situations where he'd done nothing wrong. As Frank became more comfortable owning his space in the world, he found it easier to set bigger boundaries. He started saying no to volunteer commitments that drained him. He stopped lending money to a relative who never paid him back. He began expressing his political opinions instead of staying silent when people said things he disagreed with. Frank discovered that boundaries aren't walls that keep people out. They're property lines that help people know where they stand. When we're clear about our limits, other people can relate to us more honestly and respectfully. The legacy of self-respect. As we get older, we start thinking more about the legacy we're leaving behind. What lessons are we teaching our children and grandchildren by how we live? What example are we setting about self-worth, about relationships, about what it means to be a person of value? When we constantly sacrifice ourselves to make others comfortable, we're teaching the next generation that their worth comes from their usefulness to others. When we model healthy boundaries, when we show that it's possible to be loving and self-respecting at the same time, we're giving them a gift that will serve them their entire lives. Martha from Boston, Massachusetts, realized this when her 16-year-old granddaughter came to her upset about a friendship. The granddaughter was constantly being asked to do favors, lend money, provide emotional support to a friend who never reciprocated. Martha saw herself in that story and realized she had an opportunity to break a generational pattern. Instead of advising her granddaughter to be patient and understanding, Martha shared her own story of learning to set boundaries. She helped her granddaughter practice saying no kindly but firmly. She validated her granddaughter's feelings of being used and helped her understand that real friendship should be mutual. A year later, Martha's granddaughter thanked her. She'd learned to recognize when people were trying to take advantage of her kindness. She developed friendships that were more balanced and satisfying. Most importantly, she'd learned that being kind didn't require being weak, and that self-respect was not selfish. Please take a moment to share this video with someone who might need to hear this message. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is help someone realize their own worth. Moving forward with wisdom and grace. As we wrap up today's conversation, I want you to know that it's never too late to start honoring yourself. It's never too late to start setting boundaries, to start saying no to things that drain you and yes to things that fulfill you. It's never too late to teach people how to treat you with the respect you deserve. Remember that being friendly and being weak are not the same thing. Kindness that comes from strength is more valuable than kindness that comes from fear. The people who truly care about you will respect your boundaries and appreciate your authenticity. The people who don't respect your boundaries are revealing important information about who they really are. You don't owe anyone your exhaustion. You don't owe anyone your silence when they're treating you poorly. You don't owe anyone access to you without consideration for your needs and feelings. You have the right to be selective about how you spend your time and energy. You have the right to surround yourself with people who see your value and treat you accordingly. As you move forward, remember that setting boundaries is not about becoming cold or uncaring. It's about becoming clear about your worth and communicating that worth to the world. When we respect ourselves, we give others permission to respect us too. When we model healthy relationships, we make the world a little bit better for everyone. Your life has value beyond what you can do for others. Your worth isn't determined by your availability or your agreeableness. You matter, not because of what you give, but because of who you are. Never forget that, and don't let anyone else forget it either. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this message resonated with you, please comment below and let me know. I read every comment, and I'm always encouraged to hear how these conversations impact your life. Until next time, remember that you deserve relationships that honor your worth, and it's never too late to start creating them.